8 months ago, this space was nothing but heavy clay soil and gravel. And now it's a thriving subtropical food forest here in my Northern California backyard, which is honestly starting to look and feel more like a jungle. I've done a lot to transform and create this space, and I'll soon have a full series here showing every single step of that process and everything I do to maintain it. But rather than showing you my process first and just asking you to trust that it's gonna work, I'm gonna start by showing you the results in this full tour so that you can see for yourself how every single one of these tropical and subtropical plants are absolutely thriving here in my Mediterranean climate, despite being much hotter and drier in summer and much colder in winter than almost all of these plants are adapted to grow. So now that these young plants have experienced a hot summer and winter with a few days of frost, I'll take you around to show you most of the plants that I have here and some of the fruit that I've been harvesting so far. This is my Kohala longan. It's a Hawaiian longan variety. Longans are also known as dragon's eye, and when I harvest this fruit, you'll see why it has that nickname. This tree is about 3, maybe 4 years old max, and it set a nice little crop this year. It's had about 20 fruit, and it's down to about 8 fruit left. Let's try one of these. The skin on the outside has kind of a dusty brown beige texture to it with a little bit of green and almost like a reptile scale to it. Then if I open it up, it will peel kind of like a hard-boiled egg. So that skin just comes right off. And on the inside here, it has this white sort of translucent flesh, kind of like a lychee or lychee. And now you can really see why it gets that nickname of the dragon's eye. The texture of the flesh is very similar to a grape. The flavor has a mild sweetness, almost no acidity, and it sort of has a musky flavor to it. To me, it almost reminds me of like bread or like a pastry flavor with sweetness. Very unique, not like any other fruit that I've tasted because of that musky kind of bread flavor to it. Really nice, sweet, tropical fruit with very interesting, unique flavors, and they fruit pretty young. At least this one did for me here in my food forest. The next plant I want to show you is the one right in front of this longan, and this is a pepino dulce or pepino melon. I have about a dozen or more of these planted throughout the food forest. I bought one plant last fall and propagated about 50 cuttings from it, so I planted out a bunch here and gave a bunch away, and they've really been thriving, just sprawling out. I mean, this plant here was just one little stick when I planted it in early summer, and now it's like 5 feet by 5 feet and has quite a bit of fruit on it. As you can see, it's got flowers here, it's got some young fruits that might ripen up before the frost, and it's got some that are ready to harvest. To illustrate just how simple these are to propagate, check this out. This plant was just growing along the ground here, and it's setting out these little roots. So if you want to propagate these, it's super simple. You just take a little cutting, 4 to 6 inches, take off the big leaves, trim off any flowers, put that in some potting mix, and that's going to become a whole new plant. That's what I did for all of these. Very, very simple. Let's find a little fruit. Here's a nice one. These things look so cool. I think they kind of look like a dinosaur egg. They've got this pale yellow color with these purple stripes. This one still has a little bit of green left on it, so it's probably not completely ripe, but it should be pretty good. There you can see on the inside it has a lot of small seeds, kind of a yellow flesh, pretty juicy. The flavor is very much like a honeydew. So it has a very mild, sweet melon flavor to it. The flesh texture itself is also very much like a honeydew or any other really nice ripe melon. So it's not quite as sweet as a ripe melon. Has a little bit of cucumber flavors to it, but it's a lot softer than a cucumber and a lot sweeter than a cucumber. The skin is very thin and easy to bite through. There's no real flavor to the skin. It's not bitter. It doesn't really add anything or take anything away. But a very juicy, watery fruit. And these have been extremely productive for me this summer. This is my Vernon white sapote. It's one of a few different white sapote varieties that I have planted here. Right behind me, I have a Subel white sapote. And I love these because not only is the fruit delicious, but white sapote are actually adapted to grow, thrive, and fruit really well in my zone. So I've had both of these for the past 2 years. Last year, they were both in pots next to my house. They went all summer long in full sun with no shade, and that didn't bother them. And then they went all winter long with no frost protection. That didn't bother them either. And the Vernon actually flowered and set fruit in its first year, and the fruit was delicious. Once again, full sun through summer, and now through winter. They actually have a lot of young, tender growth on them, and none of the frosts we've had so far have affected them at all. And once again, the Vernon has set fruit. I've harvested a few of them, and there's one left. So here's the fruit. Small, round, greenish yellow fruit. Usually they're about the size of a tennis ball, but this one was growing in full shade, so it's a bit smaller. Really nice, soft, creamy texture to it. The texture is almost like a very ripe avocado mixed with a very ripe pear, and it even has some subtle pear flavors to it. Mostly the flavors in it, though, are like a mixture of tropical fruits like coconut, pineapple, banana, all mixed into like a custard. So custardy sort of texture and tropical custard flavors to it. The skin and the flesh both have really nice flavor and texture. This one has one little pit in the middle. Sometimes they have more, but not much for seeds or pit in these. It's got a really good flesh to seed ratio, and it's a subtropical tree with very tropical flavors that thrives in a non-tropical area with no protection and fruits really early. So Vernon white sapote. This is my tropical green jujube, very popular in Thailand, Vietnam, and India. And if you've watched my orchard series, you're probably familiar with my Lee jujube, which is a deciduous variety. Both are related, but they're quite different. The deciduous one right now has no leaves, and it hasn't had any fruit on it for a couple of months. The tropical green jujube is evergreen, so it's going to have leaves year round, and it's been fruiting since midsummer. Still has quite a bit of fruit on it. They're both very fast growing and fruit when they're young. This thing was this tall, and it was a little twig, and it put out this branch, and it's just like quadrupled in size and put on quite a bit of fruit. So still has some fruit, but we got a lot of rain last week, so a lot of this fruit is starting to split. Either way, should be plenty good to eat, so let's try some. Really nice crunch, nice texture, great flavor, pretty juicy. The flavors are a little bit like apple and pear, and it's not as sweet as the ones I was eating earlier this season because we had all that rain. So anytime you have a lot of rain and the soil is saturated, the sugar level of any fruit is going to go way, way down. So not quite as sweet right now, but still plenty sweet. And honestly, the dominant flavor in these right now for me is young coconut, which is kind of cool to get that coconut flavor out of a fruit like this. Little pit in the center there. This is a delicious and productive tropical fruit tree, green jujube. I'm growing 5 different varieties of papayas here, but the first one I want to show you is this Bacco Papaya, because this is a naturally occurring hybrid from Ecuador that is not only frost tolerant, but it's also cold tolerant into the 20s, and it has all female flowers that are self-fruitful and have no seeds in the fruit. I had this plant for over a year now. Last year it was in a pot. It fruited its first year, and once again it is full of fruit. It still has flowers on it. It's got all this fruit. This fruit is still a little bit young. Some of the larger ones will ripen up, but some of the smaller ones won't quite make it. But if this tree performs the same way it did last year, most of this fruit will ripen up in spring. The fruit will be yellow rather than orange, little bit smaller than your common papayas and not quite as sweet as the papayas that you might be used to. It has a mild, somewhat sour, somewhat sweet flavor and a little bit of effervescence to it. That's kind of cool. So very unique, different flavor of papaya, and it's a variety that will grow in cold climates, which is perfect for me here in Northern California. Right here on this side, I've got a black sapote. Black sapote are not at all related to white sapote. They're actually related to persimmon. If you're familiar with persimmon trees, you can probably see that this foliage looks very similar to a persimmon, but persimmon are deciduous, so they lose all their leaves in the wintertime. The sapote is evergreen. And with that, they're also very frost sensitive and cold sensitive. But that said, it still has a lot of young tender growth on it that it put on in late summer that has not been affected at all from any of the frost we've had so far. So it's surprisingly looking pretty good. This tree is probably a few years old. It's grown very rapidly since I planted it in the ground, but it'll still be a few more years before it starts fruiting. It flowered this year, but the flowers didn't set any fruit. And these usually take a few years to fruit. But I happen to have a black sapote fruit that I ordered from Miami last year. I ate a couple of them, have one more that I kept in the freezer so I can show you what the fruit actually looks like. So here's the fruit. This one's still frozen, so I'm not going to cut into it, and it's a little bit frosty. But basically, it's a dark green, somewhat large fruit. This one's a little bit more of a beige brown color because it's been in the freezer, but you don't really harvest these until they are very ripe and soft, almost overripe. But then you cut into them and they look and feel like you're scooping out chocolate pudding. That's why they get the nickname of the chocolate pudding fruit. They even have a lot of flavors, I think, of chocolate pudding, but they also taste like a really ripe, sweet pumpkin. Delicious, very unique fruit, and I can't wait for this to start fruiting for me. This is an Oakleaf Papaya, and it's one of the trees here in my food forest that I'm most excited about because I actually grew this tree from a seed of the fruit that I harvested in a greenhouse in Santa Cruz last year. I started that and a bunch of other seeds in pots and then germinated them, transplanted them out. This was about 4 inches tall when I planted it. Now it's nearly 10 feet tall. It's full of fruit, and it actually has fruit that are ready to harvest right now. So that's incredible that it can grow that fast from a seed and produce fruit in less than a year. That is not very common for any fruit tree. Also, it's a papaya variety that's native to the Andes, so it's actually cold tolerant down into the low 20s. When the temperatures get that low into the low 20s, which they haven't here yet, these will become deciduous, so they'll lose all of their leaves, which is not common for papayas. So it goes deciduous, then it'll come back in spring with more foliage. So this tree still has most of its leaves, but I expect most of them to fall off by the end of winter. Another very unique thing about this papaya variety, as you can probably see, is that the fruit is teeny tiny, which makes it not only unique, but it makes it a great candidate for growing in a non-tropical zone with our shorter growing season. It actually has time to set fruit and fully ripen on the tree. Unlike the larger, more common papaya varieties that can take 6 to 9 months to actually set and fully ripen, which is fine if you're growing them in a tropical zone that's essentially warm year-round. But because here we have such a shorter growing window, a lot of times if you're trying to grow those varieties, they'll set fruit, they'll start to size up on the tree, but they won't have enough time in that warm growing season to actually ripen on the tree. So smaller fruits like this are perfect, and this one started from a seedling this year, already had time to set fruit. Next year, as it comes out of spring, as it's already established, it's going to set its fruit probably in early summer and be ready to harvest in late summer, potentially even get a second crop, as these often do. Let's try some of this fruit. So here's the fruit, about the size of an acorn, mostly orange, a little bit green, has some kind of cool stripes on there. And on the inside, it looks similar to some other papaya varieties where it has a bunch of little black seeds, a little bit of flesh, and some skin. You can eat the seeds, but they have a pretty strong flavor to them, and I want to save these to plant, so I'm going to take the seeds out. And that leaves just a little bit of flesh and a lot of skin. The flavor is actually very similar to many papaya varieties, so if you're familiar with the flavors of papaya, expect a lot of those flavors from it. It's a little bit sweet, not very tart, but slightly tart, quite herbal. Actually, I think it has a lot of flavors of nasturtium flower, if you've ever tasted those. Very unique flavor, but I think this flavor kind of hits it spot on. A little bit of spiciness, a lot of herbal flavors to that. It is January right now, so the fruit on here that's ripe is not nearly as sweet as it will be when it ripens in summer. When this tree next year actually sets its fruit early enough and ripens in summer, it's going to be a lot sweeter. But either way, delicious fruit, does have some tropical flavors to it, and it's a papaya variety that tolerates cold temperatures. Fruits ripens in cold temperatures in a short growing season, so awesome variety to grow in a non-tropical zone. Oakleaf papaya. This is a red papaya. It's a pretty common tropical papaya variety, but it's also not adapted to grow here in zone 9B. It's the most frost and cold sensitive variety of papaya that I'm growing, but it's actually done surprisingly well through the few frosts that we've had. It's had a little bit of damage, but for the most part, the top has been unscathed, but I don't expect that to continue through the whole winter here. Once we start getting into the high 20s, a lot of this top is gonna die back. But it was a foot tall when I planted it. Now it's 10 feet tall, and the trunk is about 5 inches wide at the base. So my hope and expectation is that although the top's gonna die back, the trunk itself will not completely freeze and die back, and there'll be enough energy stored in this trunk that it can bounce back in spring, then hopefully flower and fruit in late summer. It did actually flower and fruit this year, but it was in fall. The fruit is really small. It's definitely going to fall and not ripen, but hopefully this tree survives. Maybe it won't. Follow along and see. This is a Ruby Supreme guava. It's a somewhat rare guava variety, and a lot of people consider it to be one of the very best tasting tropical guavas, but I haven't tasted this fruit yet, and I will today. I came home a few days ago and found that most of the fruit had fallen off. I don't know why, because it wasn't particularly cold or hot or rainy or windy, but a lot of the fruit in different sizes, small fruits, large fruits, all fell off, and it was all completely green, so it didn't really have a chance to fully ripen on the tree because it's January right now. So I brought some of the larger fruits inside and ripened them on the counter for a few days. And after a few days, they turned to this yellow color, and they're a lot more soft. So of course this fruit won't be as sweet or as flavorful as it would be if it had a chance to ripen more on the tree, but I think it's still gonna be pretty good, and it will give me an idea of what it's gonna taste like next summer when hopefully it sets sooner and ripens in the warm weather. That is a beautiful pink guava, has a really nice seed to flesh ratio, and if you could smell this thing, it smells so good. Very sweet, very creamy, very tropical. It's like the epitome of what you would think a delicious tropical guava should taste like. Flavors of strawberry and lime. It's almost like a creamy strawberry lime sorbet. I can only imagine how delicious this fruit's gonna be next summer when it actually ripens while it's still warm. Hopefully, considering it was this delicious, ripening on my kitchen counter in January. Wow. Ruby Supreme Guava, it definitely met my expectations. Probably even exceeded them considering the fruit is this delicious in January. This is Inga Adulis, also known as ice cream bean. It's native to South America, and it gets that nickname of ice cream bean because it creates these large bean pods, and surrounding those beans in the pod, there's this white fluffy fruit that has similar flavors to vanilla ice cream, but also has a lot of cool tropical flavors in it. Very delicious, very unique fruit. And because it's a bean creating legume, it's also a nitrogen fixer. So it takes nitrogen from the air, distributes it through its roots to the other plants around it. So it makes a great mother tree for the food forest. That's why I have 2 of them growing here. Also very fast growing, so it creates kind of a shade canopy for some dappled light and a little bit of respite through our hot summers here, which a lot of these young kind of understory tropical plants want to have. So very fast growing. I mean, this thing was this tall when I planted it. Now it's grown 8 feet just since planting it in early summer. It hasn't fruited yet. I'm hoping that it fruits next summer, but at least by the following year, it probably will. But it's been taking the cold just fine. They're usually good into the high 20s. We've gotten down to 31 so far and a lot of frost so far, but it still has a lot of young, tender growth that's been completely unaffected. It's continuing to grow through winter right now. I think that's going to slow down once we get into the 20s, and it might have some dieback, but it's established enough that it will survive. It's going to grow into a pretty large tree. I'll trim it so it doesn't get so massive that I can't actually harvest the fruit, but Inga Adulis ice cream bean, I cannot wait for this to fruit and to share this with you because it is so good. This is a blue Java banana. It's a cold tolerant fruiting banana from Southeast Asia, and this thing has grown incredibly fast. It was about this tall when I planted it, then it just shot up. It's massive now. It put off 5 pups. I took 3 of them away and potted them up to leave just 3 trees right here, and the other ones have shot up as well. It hasn't fruited yet, but it's still young, so I'm hoping by maybe next summer, but at least by the following summer, it should set a nice rack of bananas. But it's tolerated the summer sun really well. It's tolerated our cold very well so far. We've had quite a few days of frost. Has a little bit of cold damage. You can see with these little black dots on the leaves. And I do expect some more cold stress as we get further into winter and our temperatures get into the 20s. But even with some dieback, this tree will be totally fine here to come back in spring. Hopefully give me some bananas. This is all turmeric or turmeric, and it's all ready to harvest. In fact, it's probably a couple of weeks past ready to harvest, but I wanted to leave this in the ground as long as possible because I planted late, so it's probably only been in the ground for about 5 months, where ideally it would grow for 7 to 9 months to get larger. Also, it's growing in a lot of shade right here, so that's going to create smaller turmeric. So more sun, more time, it would be larger, but it's grown all it's going to grow this season, so let's dig some up, see how it looks. All right, not too bad. Not quite as large as it would have grown if I had planted it earlier, but not too bad. You can see this is actually the piece that I planted. It's starting to rot, looks a little bit older, more calloused over, and it grew all of this. So I'd say it's about 4 times the size, so good return on investment. Let's spray this off and see how it actually looks. All right, I'm pretty happy with that, especially considering I planted late and did pretty much nothing with it after planting, and it's growing in a lot of shade. So turmeric, pretty easy plant to grow. Time to harvest the rest. This is one of a few different plantings of ginger that I have here, and like the turmeric, it was planted late, so I'm harvesting it a little bit later than I normally would be, and it's growing in mostly shade, so it's going to be a little bit smaller than if it were growing in more sunlight. All right, so it's a little on the smaller side as I expected, but it's met my expectations considering I planted pretty late. It's growing in a lot of shade and I've done nothing to it, just planted some of these ginger roots and they've tripled, quadrupled, a little bit more than that. So again, good little return on investment for something that's very easy and low maintenance. This is my little mango grove where I'm growing Valencia Pride, Malika, and Manila mangoes. And yes, they are planted very close together, especially considering mango trees can get enormous, but they grow a lot larger in their tropical climates. Here, they don't really grow at all in the winter time, so they naturally stay a little bit smaller, but I'll also be heavily pruning these trees and sort of growing them as one. So for me, this close planting should work fine. That said, these mangoes will probably be the most challenging plants in my subtropical food forest because they don't like intense sun and heat, and they don't have very good cold adaptations. So they've actually thrived through the sun and the heat. They pretty much have full midday exposure to the sun. That's been no problem at all. Now comes the challenge of winter. They've had a few days of frost with no protection. You can see they have this young growth here. This young light yellow green growth is certainly a lot more tender than the older, more established dark green growth. So this stuff will probably die back within a few frosts. You can already start to see it's getting these little brown black dots on it, and that's a sign of cold stress. Totally fine. The tops of these will probably die back this year, but there will be enough energy stored in these plants to bounce back in spring. And hopefully with a little bit of frost protection on our coldest days this year, when it gets into the high 20s, these plants will thrive. So I will frost protect them for the first couple of years, and then after that, they'll be out on their own to see if they make it or they don't. This is my wax jambu, and I won't yet consider this to be one of the plants in my food forest because, as you can see, it's still in a pot. I brought this home from the nursery in this container in late summer, and that wasn't a great time to plant this going into fall, and now we're going into winter. So I'll keep this in this pot through winter, then I'll plant it out in spring. But I wanted to show you this because it actually has quite a bit of fruit on it. And I'm using these little wire mesh bags to protect the fruit from any birds, squirrels, or rats, and they're working pretty well. I have a link to these in the video description below. When I brought it home from the nursery, it had no fruit, no flowers. It flowered pretty quickly, and then almost all of those flowers turned into fruit, and now the fruit is starting to drop. But this variety is supposed to be a black pearl wax jambu, which is kind of like a dark purple variety when it's ripe, and these clearly are not that color. They're kind of a pale yellow color. So either it was mislabeled at the nursery and it's a different variety, or this fruit dropped prematurely. But I think this fruit's ready to eat. Has a nice crunch, a little bit juicy, a little bit dry, slightly acidic, kind of sweet, has kind of an apple flavor to it. Actually, the flavor reminds me sort of like apple chips. If you've ever had those dry, crunchy apple chips, sort of has that flavor with a little bit of perfumey flavors to it as well. One little seed here on the inside. And then kind of like a foamy texture on the inside. Pretty good. Well, the fruit tasted fully ripe, so my assumption is that this is just a yellow variety of wax jambu, but I don't know the name of it if it is one of those. So if you grow wax jambu at home and you grow a variety that looks like this, tell me in the comments below what you think this variety might be. This is my Groomy Chama, also known as Brazilian cherry, and it's a tropical cherry native to Brazil. Not a true cherry, but has a lot of cherry characteristics to it. The fruit looks similar to cherry, has cherry flavors, very delicious. So this is actually the second crop that this Groomy Chama has put on this year. The first crop had these nice round fruit. Now this second crop, the fruit is more of a star shaped. It almost looks like Suriname cherry, and I'm not sure if that's a typical characteristic of the Groomy Chama to have two different shapes of fruit. All the pictures I've seen of this fruit have been very round, like the first crop. So if you grow these, let me know if this is something that you've experienced before with a more star-shaped fruit on a different crop. I think it's very interesting, and so far all of these fruits have tasted the same as the first crop, but just strange to see two different shapes of fruit in one plant. Has kind of an orange colored flesh with two big seeds in there. And the flavor of the fruit is really nice. A little bit of cherry flavors, a little bit of plum flavors, kind of some orange sorbet flavors in it as well. And then the skin kind of has a little bit of curry flavor to it. Not a ton of curry, but enough that I think it makes a really pleasant, interesting flavor. Groomy Chama, delicious tropical cherry. This is my lemon guava. It's one of two lemon guava plants I have here in the food forest. And of all the plants I have here, this would be my #1 recommendation if you're interested in getting into tropicals and subtropicals and you live in a marginal zone like I do here in 9B, because these take the cold really well, they take the heat really well, they're very productive, and they start producing fruit really early. This tree is probably 3 years old, but they'll start producing fruit within the first year sometimes, but usually at least within the second year. And they're very low maintenance. Also a very attractive plant, stay relatively small to medium size, and the fruit is just absolutely delicious. This beautiful yellow fruit. Soft skin, little bit of seeds inside. Very sweet, The seeds are solid, but pretty small. You can crunch through them. You can eat them totally. Super sweet, a little bit of flavor of lemon for sure. A lot of guava flavors, but a very sweet, fruity guava. Very nice texture inside, very much like a gelatin. And yeah, the skin is just really soft and really pleasant as well. One of the most delicious guavas you can grow, and as I said, one of the easiest guavas to grow, especially in my zone here, 9B. So lemon guava, excellent, excellent plant here in my food forest. These are my strawberry guava plants. I've got 5 plants planted right here, and I actually planted these long before the food forest. These have all been in the ground here for about 2 years, and they're actually in full shade. They're underneath my navel orange tree, so they don't get a lot of sun in summer or winter. A little bit of dappled light coming through here, and that's it. But as you can see, still very productive. This plant has lots of fruit on it, lots of red ones that are ripe, lots of green ones that will be ripe soon. There's a nice one right there. So these are very similar to the lemon guava, but rather than being yellow, they're red, and the fruit is a little bit smaller. Sweet, a little bit tart. They do have some strawberry flavors to them, kind of like a tart strawberry. And there are some little seeds inside, but you just swallow those seeds. Very good. Not super sweet, not as sweet as the lemon guava, but that could be because I'm growing them in full shade. Anytime you grow fruit, if you have it in sun, it's going to be a lot sweeter. If you have it in shade, if it will fruit in shade, then it's not going to be quite as sweet as if it was in full sun. But from people I've talked to who grow both strawberry and lemon guava in full sun, they still seem to agree that the lemon guava are a little bit sweeter. But it's just cool to be able to grow clusters of fruit like this in pretty much full shade. So if you got a shady spot in your yard and you want to try some subtropicals, these have done really well here with no frost protection or anything. I mean, of course they get frost protection from the tree that's above them, but very productive for full shade, and they're delicious. This is my Chilean guava, and the best way I could describe this plant would be if a huckleberry and a guava had a baby, that would be this plant. The plant itself looks like a little huckleberry plant, and the fruit looks like little huckleberries or blueberries, but they're guava and they taste like guava. These do great in pots. Last year this was in a pot and it produced a lot of little fruit, but the fruit was so small and I didn't realize that it was ripe because it was so small that I just left it all, and it eventually fell on the ground. I never ate any of it. So this year I know that these are actually ripe when they're teeny tiny like this. The tag says they're ripe when they're red, but mine have started to fall off before they're red and they're still really sweet. So I'm gonna assume that this is when they're ripe for me. Green, a little bit yellow, a little bit of a red tinge to them. And look at that, tiny little blueberry looking fruit. The flavor is just like a sweet white guava. Tiny little seeds in it, just like blueberry seeds. They're so small you kind of feel them a little bit gritty in your teeth, but nothing you have to spit out. Great flavor. These are very productive. This plant probably has about 20 little fruits on it, and I've already eaten about 10 or 20 from it, and it's still young, so hopefully in the future puts on bigger and bigger crops. And I plan on this staying pretty small. It's a nice kind of mid-story plant here for the food forest. In addition to all of these edible plants, I also have a lot of support plants throughout the food forest, like this vetiver grass, Mexican sunflower, comfrey. These are the plants that don't necessarily produce edible crops, but they play an important role in the food forest system by providing shelter and support to the food-producing plants in many ways, like cycling nutrients to build and maintain healthy soil, which is important for any garden, but that's an essential component to the food forest system. This is my passion fruit wall, where I constructed a cable trellis to support these 2 passion vines that have filled in the entire south side of this garage wall in about 3 months. Passion vines are incredibly fast growing and very productive in zones 9 and above, and I'll soon have a full video showing exactly how I created this trellis because it's one of the most effective, durable, and attractive trellises for any vining plant, and it's also very inexpensive and simple to construct. I'm actually growing 4 different varieties of passion fruit here in different sections of the food forest. A few of them are growing up these tall posts that I'm using to support this temporary shade canopy, which is another project here in the food forest that I'll have a completely separate full tutorial video on, because this is one of the key components to allowing the subtropical and tropical plants to actually grow, survive, and thrive here in my Mediterranean climate with the hot summers and the cold winters. I think this shade canopy provides just the right amount of light shade through summer and light frost protection through winter to allow these young tropical and subtropical plants to survive through these more extreme temperature swings, while also exposing them to our hot summers and our colder winters so they can start adapting to this Mediterranean climate. Speaking of which, it's now the last week of February and every plant here continues to thrive despite the fact that we've had many days with frost and some very windy storms. So I've shown you a lot of what I'm growing here in my new subtropical food forest, but I've actually just scratched the surface because I'm also growing avocado, dragon fruit, jaboticaba, lychee, pineapple, star fruit, star cherry, cherimoya, moringa, sapodilla, rose apple, yerba mate, java plum, and tons of other things that I'll be sharing with you in future videos. I'll also be sharing my entire process for how I created this food forest, soil preparation, irrigation, planting, pruning, and everything that I've done and will continue to do to allow these tropical and subtropical plants to survive and thrive here in my Mediterranean climate. So if you want to follow along, consider subscribing. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button. And as always, if you have any questions at all about my garden or your garden, ask them in the comments below. Happy gardening.